They told her to leave it. They said nature had already claimed its soul, but in the village of Oymyakon, where breath turns to ice before it hits the ground, 2-year-old Lyudmila Petrovna made a choice that would bring a pack of wolves to her door, and something far more dangerous than wolves. The thermometer bolted to the side of the log cabin read -62 degrees Celsius. It was a temperature where mechanics didn't work, where steel snapped like dry twigs, and where exposed skin died in under a minute. Lyudmila Petrovna adjusted her wool shawl, wrapping it tighter around her head until only her eyes were visible. At 82, she was the oldest resident living on the outskirts of Oymyakon, a tiny settlement in the heart of Yakutia, Siberia, the coldest permanently inhabited place on Earth. Most of her neighbors had moved closer to the town center, near the central coal heating plant, but Lyudmila refused. This cabin, with its moss-packed walls and the heavy iron stove, was where her husband, Yuri, had died. But not today. Today, the woodpile was low. She pushed open the heavy timber door. The air didn't just hit her. It bit her. A physical weight slamming against her chest. She stepped out into the white silence. The local term for the thick, freezing fog that settled when the temperature dropped below -50. She moved slowly toward the shed, her felt Valenki boots crunching loudly on the packed snow. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic thud of her own heart and the distant, cracking sound of trees splitting from the frost. As she bent to pick up a birch log, a flash of white caught her eye. It was nearly invisible against the snowbank, distinguishable only by a slight disruption in the texture of the drift. Lyudmila squinted. It looked like a discarded mitten. She reached out with her hook, intending to brush snow over it. But the mitten twitched. She froze. The movement was barely a shudder. She dropped the log and fell to her knees, ignoring the pain shooting through her arthritic joints. Digging frantically with her gloved hands, she uncovered a small, curled shape. It was an Arctic fox cub, no bigger than a grapefruit. Its fur was matted with ice, and its eyes were sealed shut. "Mother of God," she whispered, her voice cracking in the dry air. She looked around for the mother. A fox wouldn't abandon a kit in this weather unless she was dead. Lyudmila scanned the tree line. 50 yards away, near a frozen creek bed, she saw a splash of red. She struggled to her feet and waded through the waist-deep snow toward the red mark. What she found made her stomach turn. The mother fox was there, but she hadn't died of the cold. She had been caught in a jagged steel trap, her leg shattered. But worse, the carcass was fresh and skinned. A poacher. And not just any poacher. The cut of the skinning was messy, hasty. Lyudmila looked back at the house. She was alone. If the poacher was still nearby, she was a witness. In Yakutia, out here in the taiga, people disappeared all the time. The cold was a convenient accomplice to murder. She scrambled back to the woodpile. The cub was already stiffening. She scooped the tiny white ball into the deep pocket of her sheepskin coat, pressing it against her side. She grabbed 2 logs to make it look like she had just been working, then hurried back to the cabin. As she reached for the door handle, she heard it. The roar of a snowmobile engine cutting through the silence. It was coming from the direction of the creek. Lyudmila threw herself inside the cabin and slammed the heavy bolt shut. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She leaned against the door, listening. The engine noise grew louder, a high-pitched whine, and then slowed. It idled just outside her perimeter fence. She held her breath. The cub in her pocket didn't move. After a terrifying minute, the engine revved again, and the sound faded away toward the highway. Lyudmila exhaled, her breath pluming in the slightly warmer air of the mudroom. A tiny, frozen ragdoll. "No, no, little one," she murmured. She grabbed a towel, warmed it by the stove, and wrapped the kit. She sat in her rocking chair, holding the bundle against her chest, rocking back and forth. "Yuri isn't ready for guests yet. You stay here." She sat there for an hour. The cabin creaked. The wind began to pick up outside. Just as she was about to accept that the cold had won, she felt it, a single, faint thump against her palm, then another. The kit let out a sound so quiet it was almost imaginary, a high, mewling squeak. Lyudmila wept. She named him Baron right then and there, because he demanded such a high price to stay alive. But as she looked at the tiny creature, she noticed something odd. On his left ear, the tip was missing not from frostbite, but a clean, old notch. And under the white fur of his belly, there was a strange, dark marking shaped almost like a diamond. She didn't know it yet. But Baron wasn't just a fox. He was a marker. And the man on the snowmobile, a notorious local named Sergei Volkov, hadn't left because he didn't see her. He had left because he knew exactly where she lived, and he had unfinished business with what was in her pocket. For 3 weeks, the cabin smelled of warm milk and wet fur. Reviving Baron was a war of attrition. Lyudmila had to feed him every 2 hours using an eyedropper, filled with a mixture of goat's milk and raw egg. He was wild, even in his weakness. The first time he opened his eyes startlingly blue. The colour of glacial ice, he bit her thumb hard enough to draw blood. "Ungrateful aristocrat," Lyudmila scolded, wrapping a bandage around her finger. Baron hissed, retreating under the majestic mahogany wardrobe that had belonged to Lyudmila's grandmother. It was his fortress. He would only come out when the fire died down and the shadows stretched long across the floorboards. The isolation of Oymyakon usually comforted Lyudmila, but now it felt like a cage. She couldn't go to the village market without looking over her shoulder. He was a man who supplied furs to the black market in Yakutsk. He was violent, a drunkard, and he had a terrifying reputation for holding grudges. If he knew she had the cub, he would come. Not just for the pelt, but because a white fox cub in winter could be sold alive to private collectors in Moscow for thousands of dollars. One Tuesday, Lyudmila had to go into town. Her supplies were critically low. She locked Baron in the bedroom, barricading the door with a heavy chair, and trekked the 2 miles to the village outpost. The general store was crowded. The generator had failed in the east sector, and people were buying candles and kerosene. Lyudmila kept her head down, grabbing a sack of flour and a tin of powdered milk. "Lyudmila Petrovna." The voice boomed across the store. The chatter stopped. Standing by the counter, peeling an orange with a hunting knife, was Sergei Volkov. He was a bear of a man, wearing a pristine wolf fur hat and smelling of gasoline and cheap vodka. Lyudmila stiffened. "Sergei, you haven't been to church," Sergei said, smiling. His teeth were stained with tobacco. "Father Andrei was asking about you. He worries an old woman alone out there." "Things happen. I am fine," she said, placing her rubles on the counter. Sergei took a step closer. He lowered his voice. "I lost something near your land a few weeks back. A trap line. Someone messed with it. I don't go near the creek, Sergei. The snow is too deep for my hips." Sergei stared at her. His eyes flicked to her bandaged thumb. "Nasty cut you have there." "Kitchen knife?" "Wood splinter," she lied smoothly. He stared at her for a second longer, the smile never reaching his eyes. "Be careful, Lyudmila. Wolves are hungry this year. They smell weak things. They smell fresh meat." She grabbed her groceries and walked out, her heart pounding so hard she felt dizzy. When she got back to the cabin, the sun had already set. She fumbled with her keys, her fingers numb. She pushed the door open and stopped dead. The cabin was freezing. The door to the bedroom, the one she had barricaded, was smashed open. The chair lay splintered on the floor. "Baron!" she screamed, dropping the flour. She ran into the bedroom. The window was shattered. Glass covered the floor, glittering like diamonds in the moonlight. The snow from outside had drifted in, covering the rug. The wardrobe was open. Lyudmila fell to her knees, looking under the bed, under the dresser. "Baron!" Nothing. She rushed to the broken window. Outside, in the snow, were heavy boot prints. Men's boots, leading away toward the forest. But alongside them, there were no small paw prints. They had taken him. Lyudmila stood in the freezing room, the wind whipping her grey hair around her face. Fear was gone. In its place was a cold, hard rage, the kind of rage that kept people alive in the tundra when they should have frozen to death. She went to the closet in the hallway and reached to the very top shelf. Her hands grasped the cold steel of Yuri's old double-barreled TOZ 3-4 shotgun. She hadn't fired it in 10 years. She cracked it open. Empty. She fumbled in the drawer for the box of shells. She loaded 2, the click-clack sound echoing in the empty house. She wasn't just an old woman anymore. She was a daughter of Yakutia. She walked out the door, following the boot prints into the dark, frozen taiga. She didn't care about the cold. She didn't care about Sergei Volkov. She was going to get her fox back. But the tracks didn't lead where she expected. They didn't head toward the road or the village. They headed deeper into the forest, toward the abandoned meteorological station, a place locals called the Dead Zone because of the lingering radiation from Soviet-era experiments. And as Lyudmila trudged through the snow, she saw something that made her stop. About 100 yards from her cabin, the boot prints became erratic. There was a patch of disturbed snow, a drop of blood, and then the boot prints turned into a run. Something was hunting the hunter. The wind inside the tiger was different than on the open plains. It didn't just push, it screamed through the pine needles, creating a disorienting cacophony that masked the sound of approaching danger. Lyudmila Petrovna's lungs burned with every inhalation of the negative 60 degrees Celsius air. The cold was a physical weight, a heavy blanket of needles pressing against her face. She followed the erratic boot prints of Sergei Volkov for 20 minutes. Her old Valenki boots dragging through the powder. She was 82, her back was bent, and her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer effort of keeping her blood circulating. The tracks led her into the perimeter of the abandoned meteorological station. It was a ghost town of rusting radar dishes and collapsing concrete bunkers from the Soviet era. The locals avoided it. They said the metal sang at night. Lyudmila saw the snowmobile first. It had crashed into the remnants of a concrete pylon. One ski bent upward like a broken limb. The engine was dead. "Sergei!" she shouted, the wind tearing the name from her lips. No answer. She gripped the TOZ, 3-4 shotgun tighter. She followed the boot prints away from the wreck toward the main bunker, a windowless block of grey concrete half buried in a snowdrift. The heavy steel door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open with the barrel of her gun. The darkness inside smelled of mold, old diesel, and fresh, coppery blood. "Don't shoot, you crazy hag," the voice came from the corner. Lyudmila adjusted her eyes to the gloom. He was clutching his leg. His expensive wolf fur coat was torn at the shoulder, and his face was pale, slick with sweat despite the freezing temperature. Beside him, lying on the dirty concrete floor, was a burlap sack. It was tied shut with a rough knot. It wasn't moving. "Where is he?" Lyudmila stepped forward, leveling the shotgun at Sergei's chest. "That thing! It's cursed!" Sergei spat, grimacing as he shifted his leg. "I took it, and the engine died. Just died! And then they came. Who came? The shadows," Sergei whispered, his eyes darting to the open door behind Lyudmila. "I saw them in the trees. 6 of them. Maybe 7. Big. Bigger than timber wolves." Lyudmila ignored him. She dropped to her knees beside the burlap sack. She needed to know if Baron was still breathing. Her gloved hands fumbled with the knot. She pulled it open. Baron was inside. The fox cub was curled into a tight ball, his eyes wide and terrified, his white fur matted with the dust of the sack. He hissed when the light hit him. But when he smelled Lyudmila, the scent of milk and wool, he scrambled out of the bag and buried his face in her coat. He was shaking violently. "I have him," Lyudmila said softly, standing up. She glared at Sergei. "You will freeze here, Volkov, and I will not carry you. You can't leave me!" Sergei roared, trying to stand, but his leg buckled. Lyudmila turned to the door. At first, she saw only the swirling snow. Then, she saw the lights. 2 yellow orbs appeared in the darkness of the doorway. Then 2 more. Then 4. They stepped silently into the dim light of the bunker's entrance. Grey wolves. But these were not the starving scavengers usually seen near the village trash heaps. These were massive, primeval beasts, their winter coats thick and silver-tipped. The pack leader, a massive male with a scar running down his snout, stepped fully into the room. He was huge, his shoulders nearly reaching Lyudmila's waist. He lowered his head, a low, rumbling growl vibrating through the concrete floor. Sergei screamed, scrambling backward until he hit the wall. "Shoot them! Shoot them, Lyudmila!" Lyudmila raised the shotgun. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had 2 shells. There were 6 wolves. The alpha wolf didn't look at Sergei. He looked straight at Lyudmila. Or rather, he looked at the trembling white ball of fur peeking out from her sheepskin coat. The twist wasn't that the wolves were hunting Sergei. The twist was that they weren't hunting at all. They were retrieving. In the silence of the bunker, Lyudmila realized the truth about the skinned mother she had found weeks ago. The trap hadn't just caught a fox. It had caught a member of the pack's entourage. In the high Arctic, solitary species sometimes form strange, symbiotic alliances. Foxes follow bears. Sometimes they follow wolves, scavenging kills and acting as scouts. Baron wasn't just a pet. He was the pack's mascot. But Sergei didn't know that. Panic overtook him. He pulled a hunting knife from his belt and lunged at the nearest wolf. "No!" Lyudmila screamed. The movement broke the standoff. The pack exploded into motion. The bunker erupted into chaos. Sergei slashed wildly, the knife catching a younger wolf on the snout. The beast yelped and snapped back, its jaws clamping onto Sergei's forearm. The poacher shrieked, the sound echoing off the concrete walls like a gunshot. The alpha wolf ignored the scuffle. He lunged straight for Lyudmila. Lyudmila squeezed the trigger. Click. A dud shell. The old ammunition, stored in damp drawers for a decade, had failed her. She didn't have time to pump the second barrel. The alpha was airborne. Lyudmila turned her back, curling around Baron to shield him with her own body, bracing for the tearing of teeth against her neck. She felt the heavy impact of the wolf hitting her, knocking her into the dust. But the bite never came. Instead, a high-pitched, piercing bark filled the room. Lyudmila opened her eyes. She was on the floor. Standing on her chest, tiny but ferocious, was Baron. The white fox cub was arching his back, his hackles raised, his teeth bared. The massive wolf had stopped inches away. His muzzle was practically touching the fox's nose. The room fell into a stunned silence. Even the wolves attacking Sergei paused, looking to their leader. Baron didn't back down. He nipped at the alpha's nose, then turned and licked Lyudmila's chin, then turned back to the wolf and barked again. It was a communication, clear as day. She is mine. She is the pack. The alpha let out a huff, a burst of steam from his nostrils. He leaned forward and sniffed Lyudmila's face. His breath smelled of raw meat and snow. He licked the top of Baron's head, a rough, wet rasp. Then, the alpha turned his golden eyes toward the corner. Sergei was sobbing, clutching his bleeding arm. The alpha chuffed. The pack turned and melted back into the shadows of the doorway, silent as ghosts. The alpha paused for one last second, looking at Lyudmila, then vanished into the white storm. They left Sergei alive. He wasn't worth the kill. He was broken. Lyudmila lay on the freezing concrete for a long time, the adrenaline draining out of her, leaving her shaking uncontrollably. Baron curled up under her chin, purring like a cat. "Okay," she whispered, stroking his ears. "Okay, little Baron, you saved me." The trek back was brutal. Lyudmila couldn't help Sergei walk, but she fashioned a sled from the debris of the bunker and the snowmobile seat. She dragged him, inch by inch, back toward the main road where the truck drivers might see them. It took her 4 hours. By the time the headlights of a logging truck cut through the fog, Lyudmila's hands were black with frostnip. The driver, a man named Arthur Pendleton, a Western researcher studying permafrost in the region, jumped out of the cab. He found an 2-year-old woman collapsing in the snow, a 200-pound man tied to a sled behind her, and a white Arctic fox standing guard over her body, refusing to let anyone near until Lyudmila gave a weak nod. 6 months later, Sergei Volkov lost 3 toes to frostbite and was arrested for poaching and assault after Arthur Pendleton's dashcam footage and testimony corroborated Lyudmila's story. He never returned to Oymyakon. Lyudmila did not keep Baron in a cage. As the spring thaw arrived, turning the white silence into a landscape of green moss and rushing water, she opened the cabin door. Baron hesitated on the threshold. He looked at the forest, then back at the rocking chair where he had slept every night. "Go," Lyudmila said, smiling through her tears. "You are a king." He left, vanishing into the birch trees, but he didn't leave for good. To this day, if you visit the outskirts of Oymyakon, you might see her. Lyudmila sits on her porch, drinking tea, and often, just at the edge of the woods, a white fox sits watching her. Sometimes he brings his own kits Tiny. And sometimes, on the coldest nights, when the aurora borealis dances green and purple overhead, The locals say they see a massive timber wolf standing on the ridge behind her cabin, watching over the house of the woman who belongs to the pack. Lyudmila proved that even in the coldest place on earth, the warmth of a single act of kindness can melt the cruelest fate. She didn't just save a fox, she earned the respect of the wild itself. It's a reminder that nature watches, and nature remembers. If this story chilled you to the bone and warmed your heart, please hit that like button. It helps us find more incredible true stories like this one. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a journey into the wild. What would you have done in that bunker? Let me know in the comments below.